we'll be going up in here, and it will be muddy and slippery. So.
In a soggy green space tucked between Dexter and 4th Avenue, a team of volunteers find footing on a muddy embankment, grabbing onto tree branches for support as they walk deeper into the small roadside wooded area and toward the remnants of a small encampment. They gather cushions, tents, books, needles, blankets, and keepsakes, all left over, they say, from the camp of a person they found here dead 2 weeks prior.
Checking on the camps, that were still set up, and yeah, I happened to come across a fully decomposed body. It was laying in a tent. He was all fully clothed. He was wrapped up in his blankets and stuff when I pulled him out and had him laying on my knees, because I was on my knees pulling stuff out of the tent. And it was a real shock to me. I mean, I've seen a lot of bodies in my time, but seeing one fully decomposed.
Volunteers called the Seattle Police Department to report the death. Officers responded, and the bones are now being examined. With the fluid nature of homeless camp populations and no definitive head count on this camp from any official organization, questions remain on just how many people lived here, who knew this person, and who knows what happened to them. There's no available identification yet from the King County Medical Examiner's office, leaving a mystery on how this person died and who they were. Some people see the remains forgotten, long enough to decompose down to the bone, and they ask, how many more will be found like this person? Those volunteers are members of nonprofit Weart Seattle. In the absence of verified answers, volunteers act as amateur detectives, piecing together what they can through the debris. Among their findings are glass bottles, strung up on branches like ornaments, a veritable library of novels, and enough needles to fill multiple biohazard containers. They conclude in their amateur assessment that this person was likely a voracious reader, with an unbroken taste for decor and a crippling intravenous drug addiction.
He's got his cooker in here.
This is somebody who has a lot of trauma. I don't believe they're one paycheck away from making their rent from getting fired from Boeing or wherever. I believe this is just addiction gets the best of people. They're in a cycle. There's no way a person chooses this way and stays out here to languish and eventually die if drugs are not involved. And the evidence is clear.
Andrea Suarez founded Weart Seattle during the pandemic and today acts as the nonprofit's executive director. She leads a handful of staff and rotating teams of volunteers in what the website describes as a, quote, action-based, boots-on-the-ground movement that organizes trash cleanups in our public spaces and offers resources to those in need.
We've been doing this for 3 years. This is our 330th pick. Over 1 million pounds of trash removed from green spaces and encampments in 3 years with over 11,000 hours of volunteer boots-on-the-ground labor.
But as a private organization operating on public land, some ask, who is Weart Seattle accountable to? Weart Seattle isn't officially contracted with any city or government agency. The King County Regional Homelessness Authority and Washington Department of Transportation both say they do not coordinate with Suarez's organization. A spokesperson from Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell's office says in an email that the city does not pay Weart Seattle for any services. She also writes that it's not a registered volunteer group with Seattle Parks and Recreation. Instead, the nonprofit relies solely on donations, which Suarez estimates is in the $700,000 range this fiscal year. In terms of relationships with local leaders, Suarez previously told Seattle's Morning News on Cairo News Radio that she viewed her actions cleaning up the camps as disruptive to the status quo.
There's some workers working behind you. What are they doing?
They are like in an archaeological dig site, picking up trash from 5, 6, plus 10 years ago. It could be part illegal dumping, part accumulated trash by the people living here. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of used needles, cookers, tourniquets, and other drug paraphernalia that King County hands out through the needle exchange program. So I do question what the term exchange is in that failing program that is really just enabling people to die out here alone.
But now, with 5 of 9 Seattle City Council members being new to the job, Suarez says she's experienced a change in her interactions with some of them.
5 out of the now 8 appointed and elected city council members have been out here boots on the ground with us, litter picking. Our city attorney's been out here litter picking. Ann Davidson, Sarah Nelson, Rob Sacca, Kathy Moore, Bob Kettle came out to an event. So I feel very hopeful that we now have a council that's supporting private funded collaborative efforts that are helping guide them on what's working, what's not, and giving a voice to addicts.
Unlike service providers contracted through King County Regional Homelessness Authority, Suarez said she thinks drug treatment for people suffering from addiction should come before housing.
Needles that are handed out by King County as a form of harm reduction. The current Housing First funding doesn't give money to people who are trying to give people a hand up and path out of addiction. And so Weart Seattle is using a lot of our donations to fund recovery-oriented housing here forward.
Refusing to commit to prioritizing Housing First has historically left her out of broad homelessness outreach coordination in the county. It's also earned her and Weart Seattle a contested reputation as either a maverick or a renegade, depending on your views. But it's a reputation that Suarez apparently embraces.
Don't talk to homeless about addiction or recovery, and don't go knocking on their door. They don't knock on your door. And I say, well, isn't that the exact definition of a stigmatizing, is to not acknowledge the person as a human being, that they too might want a clean house, they too might want a clean and sober pathway out. And so for that I say, let's knock on those tent doors, go within 20 feet, do a welfare check. All hands on deck. Everybody can be an outreach worker.
During its 3-year run, the Fire from the Hip approach has also gained Weart Seattle much attention, but much of it is highly critical. Search engine results for the nonprofit's name lead to countless accusations across multiple social media platforms. The posts accuse Weart Seattle of lying to people living in the camps about who they are, and not getting permission from people before throwing their belongings away. The scathing entries come from critics as well as those purporting to be close to homeless people Weart Seattle has interacted with. An entire website is dedicated to documenting alleged misdeeds of the organization. Cairo News Radio spoke with one man, William Hughes, known independently from the websites and social media. He previously lived under the Ship Canal Bridge for 2 years, and he says he's run into Suarez and Weart Seattle volunteers at multiple camps.
And then she walks by this one tent and she goes, wow, that tent is, and just steps on it and like says, yeah, that's trash. And it was our friend's tent. He wasn't there for a couple of days because he had to go do some things, but he lived there and his stuff was in there. And she said, looks like trash to me. Right in my guy's face. You know, I mean, I thought, that's somebody's friend's tent you just squished like that.
Compared to groups like, I don't know if you know Just Cares, or compared to other groups that are contracted with KCRHA, how would you compare those groups with Weart Seattle?
They have accountability, bottom line.
But it's this same lack of affiliation with local government that worries some advocates and activists.
But when like Reach and Lead will go out and do when they'll go out and do outreach, these are trained social workers that are also, they're also coming along, so they have the training and knowledge to make that harm less impactful, if that makes sense. I don't think anyone on Andrea's board, including Andrea herself, has any prior experience with that. No one is a trained social worker. I mean, there are some things that you can do that you don't necessarily need to go to college and get a degree for, but with casework especially, it's not just something you can go around and say, I'm a social worker or I'm a caseworker, and that has happened in the past.
It's hard enough to trust anybody in the situations many people are in, and I know outreach workers have to spend a lot of effort in some cases demonstrating that they're sincere. It's a real issue. It's creating more barriers.
Suarez claims she chooses camps to target for cleanups and then does, quote, welfare checks. I asked about the visits and her credentials.
When you're doing those welfare checks, do you have caseworkers here with you?
We are caseworkers. Tim and I are caseworkers. We've been doing this for 3.5 years. We've been through trauma-informed care training, de-escalation training, on-the-job training. My educators are the 200 people and the thousands of homeless that we've met right here on the slopes that have said, you guys are game changers.
But in terms of state or city license for caseworking,
I don't know, did Jesus Christ have a license?
Oh God, she pulled that one on you too, huh? And I'm a clergy, and I love Jesus just as an excellent person, but don't pull that one in and for what you're doing, because that wouldn't, Jesus wouldn't do the things I've seen her do.
The topic of whether Suarez maintained proper credentials to identify herself as a caseworker came up in March 2021 at the Youth Care Orion Center in Seattle for homeless young people. Orion Center's Director of Marketing Pasha Scott recounts the details from an incident report filed by staff at the time.
A woman came to the Orion Center one evening and knocked on the door, and the staff on site that evening let her in, and she said she was a young person's case manager, identifying that young person by name. And at that point, the staff asked that she identify herself and her agency, and she said she was Andrea Suarez with Weart Seattle. She was not known to the staff as a caseworker, as a case manager.
Scott says case management is an internal service provided at Orion Center, so when Suarez allegedly asked about one of their young clients by name, staff asked her to stand outside to protect the privacy of other young clients. According to Scott, Suarez took that to mean she was being kicked out. When asked about accusations and criticisms of her as well as her organization, Suarez dismisses them as either exaggerations or lies.
It's manufactured controversy on some random website. Even people who are out here living rough are like, I read that, and it's like, yeah, it sounds like some woman has it after you. Like, it's just a middle school playground set of accusations that has nothing to do with the real work we're doing. Anybody that comes out here and volunteers from us, if anything, thank you for the publicity, haters, because, no good deed goes unpunished. And if you're not out here with us, then you have no right having any opinion there or otherwise about what we're doing, because you don't know. And we've saved lives, we've created jobs, we've restored green spaces, and frankly, I think we have become unassailable. They've quieted way down.
Since that interview, Suarez sent in additional comments responding to the allegations. She disputes the validity of the highly critical website weartseattle.exposed. She points out its lack of bylines with each article posted. In fact, the site doesn't list the author of every post, only occasionally mentioning first names of people purportedly involved. Its only official attribution is at the bottom of the page, an apparent copyright for a group named Concerned Citizens Against Weart Seattle 2023. The message from Suarez continues, saying Weart Seattle is made of, quote, everyday citizens in volunteer groups, end quote, that are, quote, making a positive daily impact, end quote. Suarez says they are taking action to support the city even when sometimes there is opposition that doesn't always see things the way they do. While Suarez and her nonprofit defend themselves from accusations of theft and impropriety, a man who formerly served as their board's president defends against 19 criminal counts in the state of Oregon. Kevin Dahlgren, who led a charismatic social media presence centered around helping homeless people, is now facing charges for allegedly stealing the identities of unsheltered people near Portland. Court documents indicate he was working as a homeless services specialist for the city of Gresham, Oregon at the time. He's also listed in Weart Seattle's 2022 financial statement as having been paid nearly $30,000 for consulting fees.
Maybe the state needs to take a look at their nonprofit activities and see what they're doing, considering their former president has a lot of indictments for some very
aggravated identity theft
for all of those things.
Suarez says he had limited involvement with her organization.
In short, validating what I was already doing. He has 20 plus years in the field, but there's not any reason to believe that he took or stole or committed any crime while, on the clock, so to speak, with Weart Seattle here in Seattle, and we're heartbroken for anybody harmed and wish him, the best path out that's fair and justice, fair and equitable for all.
Among her ranks of volunteers are some avid supporters of her character. This man, DJ Ziggler, used to be homeless. It's how he says he met Suarez and Weart Seattle.
Well, I know that Andrea accepted me as I am at that time. And she didn't put a bunch of stipulations on me. She didn't have a bunch of expectations. She just gave me that taste of that work ethic that I so much craved.
He says she offered him a, quote, stipend to work with her team moving his things, but could not recall the value of it when asked. He says he later checked himself in with authorities on an outstanding warrant before going to detox for meth addiction. Ziggler says without Suarez and Weart Seattle, he doesn't know if he'd have done the same thing.
And the nice thing is the picks are only 2 or 3 or 4 hours, so it's just a taste of enough to get you in track. And then you start, and then that 2 hours turns into 4 hours, turns into 6 hours that I'm able to actually work or function. So in the beginning, it was 2 hours or 3 hours every Saturday, and that was just enough to be able to start a process and get me back on track.
Suarez contends she and others in her organization are going against the grain for a good cause, some of few entities in the greater Seattle homelessness industrial complex that she believes are carrying out meaningful action without the burden of dogma. Their critics say their actions only worsen the situation in the long term, with no direct tie to a governmental body for accountability. People like Hughes search for those they can trust to help them out of the trenches of homelessness and the ideological crossfire surrounding it.
It's like, just trying to stay out of harm's way, I think, is what we kind of trying to preach.
Try to turn the other cheek.
Man, they are getting thin, bro. But I kind of have to. I have to be lenient, and I have to understand that everybody's at a different POV.
Despite the accusations and doubt cast on the organization's ethics, Weart Seattle and its volunteers were the ones to find the person's remains near Dexter Avenue. It's city land, and yet city crews had not found the person's corpse long enough for it to decompose down to the bone. It's unknown when the city's next planned cleanup trip to the piece of land was scheduled to be, so without Weart Seattle's visit to the camp on January 8th, it's unclear when the person's remains would have been found, and with it, future closure for the person's family wondering just where their relative went. In the meantime, some in Seattle wonder how many others have died forgotten on public land, and how many more will be found. I'm Sam Campbell for Cairo News Radio and MyNorthwest.com.